welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Today, in the spirit of the diversity of content that we've been trying to achieve on the program, we have a guest with an international flavor, but also returning somewhat to the conversation around COVID-19, which is, of course, very topical, not only in Canada, but throughout the world. We have Dr. Paul Frijters here, professor of economics, a world-renowned professor of economics. And we're going to talk to him and try to mine some of his best ideas about COVID-19, in particular about non-pharmaceutical interventions, otherwise known as lockdown measures. You'll hear that he's been very outspoken from the very beginning. Many of his ideas about COVID-19 are, let's say, counter-narrative, but turned out to be very prescient. So we're going to have this conversation with him and get to know him a little bit better, and hopefully have a really interesting conversation with him. Before we go there, as you know, the people who regularly watch the program, we've got a few aphorisms, quotations to kind of frame the conversation. The first one I have today is from Aristotle, who famously wrote, "There is only one way to avoid criticism: do nothing, say nothing, be nothing." The second is from Carl Jung, who famously wrote, "Where your fear is, there your task is." The third is from Ludwig Born, who famously wrote, "Losing an illusion makes you wiser than finding a truth." The last one that I'm going to point to, just to frame the conversation a little bit, is from a Canadian economist who has ideas somewhat consistent with our guest. This is from April of 2021. It's the abstract from a report from a Canadian economist named Douglas Allen, entitled "COVID Lockdown Cost and Benefits: A Critical Assessment of the Literature." And you'll see it on the screen there. It says, an examination of over 80 COVID-19 studies reveals that many relied on assumptions that were false, which tended to overestimate the benefits and understate the costs of lockdowns. As a result, most of the early cost-benefit studies arrived at conclusions that were refuted later by data, and which rendered their cost-benefit findings incorrect. Research done over the past 6 months has shown that lockdowns have, at best, a marginal effect on the COVID-19 deaths. It goes on to say that lockdown restrictions were not able to prevent non-compliance, and non-lockdown jurisdictions benefited from voluntary changes in behavior that mimicked lockdowns. And of course, here's the kicker. It says at the end, it says, it is possible that lockdown will go down as one of the greatest peacetime policy failures in Canadian history. So with that, we turn to our guest, Professor Frijters. Thank you for being with us. I understand, are you joining us from London, sir?
I'm joining you from Saudi Arabia, but I also have an appointment in London. It was great to see you and great to be on the show, Leighton.
Thank you for being here all the way from Saudi Arabia. Wow, you really get around. We're going to talk about it a little bit just by way of biography. The professor is, I understand, is currently a professor in Wellbeing Economics, and was teaching the master's course in Wellbeing and Public Policy. He specializes in applied micro-econometrics, including labor, happiness, health and health economics, though he's also worked on pure theoretical topics in macro and micro fields. And in his biography, at least on this one, it says was advising the UK government and others on how to implement well-being policies at the national and regional level. He's completed his master's in econometrics at the University of Groningen, including a 7-month stay in Durban, South Africa, before completing a PhD at the University of Amsterdam into well-being in Russia during the transition. So here we have a man with a very distinguished academic career, and started something called Wellbeing. I want to ask him about that. That's very fascinating, and has also lived for a period of time in Australia. So we want to ask him about that too. So that's a bit of a short biography, Professor. Before we get into some of these topics that I know you want to talk about and that you can talk about authoritatively, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background, where you grew up, and what drew you to the very intense study of economics.
Gladly. I'm a Dutch boy, born and raised in the Netherlands, in Utrecht, right smack in the center, one of the oldest cities, a Roman settlement. My dad was Dutch, my mother was English. I'm a bit of a hybrid, bit in between the Anglo-Saxon world and the continent, as it were. I sort of went to the regular schools and universities. But as a very young man, I had the illusion that if only I was good enough at maths and stats and learned all that, I would understand everything about the universe. I even saw economics as sort of, the wimps, the wishy-washy people, because that's how you're raised to think. I did econometrics, and then gradually sort of get more into economics, because that's where the interesting questions were. And I always doubted that, as it were, the biggest problems of the world were a math problem. They always seemed to be more social problems for me. And I was more and more disappointed at how most people who are good at math and stats have no interest in human behavior whatsoever. They're trying to flee from it. That's why they're interested in math and stats. And so I veered more towards economics, towards real-world phenomena. And I was very interested in well-being, because it seems to me to provide a way to sort of get a handle on what's most important for people, and hence a way to get to advice towards government and organizations as to what they can actually do for people. So the preamble of the American Constitution, the inalienable rights of the pursuit of happiness, I took that seriously. And so I was looking for measures in which you could try and sort of really pursue that idea in an empirical way, and that's how we got to well-being.
Professor, I wonder if you could explain. I think most people would have a sense of what economics are, what the study of them are. Could you explain what econometrics are and how that relates to the study of well-being, which has become a big part of your life?
Yes, you can see econometrics as the more technical part of economics. It comes out of the field of logistics, even war logistics. It comes out of lots of data and statistical analysis. And so it's sort of a view of optimizing the world in terms of everything that can be measured and modeled. So you learn about simulations, you learn about putting things into theoretical models, you learn lots and lots of techniques, and it's about probability theories as well as function theory. So it's effectively 3-4 years of nothing but maths and stats, and you worry less about applications, and there's all kinds of pure things in that field. But from that field, you basically have an enormous toolkit, so you're not afraid of mathematics and statistics anymore. That's very useful in COVID times, because of course we're confronted by the magic of the SIR models and the magic of reading everything about hospitals and cases and one disease versus others, and hence many years of spending in the weeds of statistics and mathematics prepares you for that kind of use of magic, if you like.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I noticed about you, and why I really wanted to have you on the program, I'm grateful that you're here, is I did a study of some of the other interviews that you've done on YouTube, and also I had a close look at your book that we're going to talk about. And you said something that I don't think I've heard anyone else say on COVID-19, and that is you talked about this concept of following the science, but you talked about it in a very different context. You talked about it in terms of it really is a lie and a deception in the context of COVID-19 lockdowns. Do you understand what I mean? Well, in the sense that my understanding is that, and you'll explain this better than I can, but just to be clear, your opinion seems to be that lockdowns and the approach of lockdowns in response to COVID-19 was really an abandonment of everything that people like you and scientists knew about how to deal with something like a pandemic. And that the people who followed the science were not really following the science; they were actually following a lie. Is that an oversimplification of your thought there?
No, that's totally correct. That's indeed, and I thought like that immediately at the start. So in mid-March 2020, we even wrote, an almost an obituary to reason and to the scientific method. Because lockdowns, to me, where with all the knowledge we had of 100 years of medical science, but also of social science, we're clearly going to achieve very little and have huge costs. And there are an abandonment of the blueprints that were around. There are an abandonment of all the plans that have been written by 50 years of virologists and immunologists, even what the WHO and various organizations were advising right up till about February 2020. And they were not based on experiments. They were not based on science at all. They were based on sort of false interpretations of data as well. And I saw it much more as a mass sacrificial event, which is then, as it were, dressed up to look like science. So it was almost like a perversion of science, a rape of science. You sort of have models and data, but really only as a kind of a garnishing on what is more a medieval sacrificial attitude. So I saw these lockdowns in the various other areas as akin to people sacrificing humans and livestock, supposedly for a fearful God.
Mm-hmm.
So it had nothing to do with science. I still view it that way. I mean, it's only gotten worse in a way. The perversion of science has become monstrous in the last 2 years.
We had another renowned economist and also an epidemiologist on the program, who I'm proud to say is a friend of mine. That's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. And I know you're familiar with his work, as I've heard you speak about the Great Barrington Declaration. It's fascinating to me that both he and you were ones who seemed to understand very clearly early on that this was a tremendously bad idea. And I asked him the same question. So I'm curious to know from you, why were you so certain early on that this was really a woefully bad idea in terms of not only economics, but in terms of health?
I know Jay, and I respect him very much, and I've met him. I've had the pleasure of sort of, comparing notes, and indeed we have an extremely similar view of everything, but we didn't know each other before at all. When I came to this problem, sort of maybe the 1st of March 2020, so 2 weeks before the lockdowns, I had really not thought about it much. I sort of felt that there was a lot of fear going around, and I'm not very susceptible to fear myself, so I was looking on a bit in bemusement, but I didn't have a real opinion. But when it started to affect the behavior of everybody around me, and everybody was getting emotionally excited, I sort of thought, okay, I'll take more of a look. And so I looked at the data coming out of Wuhan, and I looked at the data that was being used in various models, including in the Oxford Gupta team, that had a very sensible IFR of about 0.14, if I recall, so pretty much what Ron now says is the right number for the world. And I looked at the huge age distribution, so I was aware of the fact that it basically did not affect the working population of the youth, and that we are looking at a disease which is only relevant for those people who are very old with multiple morbidities. And so I knew very quickly that, as it were, the loss was going to be concentrated in a very small group. And also that this virus was spreading so quickly that there was no stopping it, and that we were eventually all going to get it in some way or another. And hence that one has to think in terms of focused protection at best. And that's, of course, what the Great Barrington Declaration said. Mm-hmm. But I had the advantage of having worked on the Soviet system in Russia, and so I knew what centrally planned economies would do to their own population. And the huge imposition of the lockdowns immediately looked like that, the idea of forcing the economy, which is a ridiculous notion. I was also offended by the notion of essential workers, essential workers, and I knew immediately from the well-being literature that how much depression and anxiety was going to be created, like getting people to stay at home, stopping schools, and worse, sort of preventing them from being human, from hugging each other, seeing each other up close, being intimate. I knew that the effects of that were horrible. I mean, this is the worst thing you can do to people. That's why we put people in solitary confinement in prisons. We want to punish them, and that's among hardened criminals still a terrible thing to do to someone. So I basically knew the huge mountain of misery that these lockdowns were going to cause, and I had access to data that told me that on the other side there was no more than a mole to could be one. And that convinced me, right? I mean, just basically the data and knowledge of how bad lockdowns were going to be from 50 years of social science made it a no-brainer. And that was true for pretty much everybody directly in my field in the UK as well. We sort of all looked around and said, this is madness. This is going to cost a mountain. It's not going to get us more than a multi. And then you start to organize, right? You start to organize with other academics around the world. My longtime co-author, Gigi Foster, reached out. we come to the same conclusion independently, and so then we started to network. And of course, the Great Barrington Declaration was like this clarion call from the world of medics. And because it was so medicalized as a problem, it was also very appropriate. You know, we'd all follow a medical standard bearer for more sensible policies. And that happened to be the Great Barrington Declaration. I was one of the early signatories, but I wasn't involved in filling it. But I tried to convince everybody I knew to also sign up to it. I'm very proud to say that there was almost 1 million people around the world who signed up. So, we were not alone then. That was only a small percentage, of course, of the people who would have signed up if only they'd heard about it. So it told me that there were plenty of scientists around the world who saw what was going on, but censorship and oppression were pushing them out of the limelight and pushing them out of sort of the public debate in their country.
Professor, a couple of things you said there, I just want to follow up on. The one is the point that you made about this apparent complete lack of a cost-benefit analysis by legislators, rulers who impose these lockdowns. Dr. Bhattacharya talked about this in terms of a term that he coined called trickle-down economics. I'm sure you'll appreciate what he's talking about. But what he said, and which was really never really explained to people, is how, you know, the lockdown measures, first of all, the most vulnerable people in the population are going to have the worst health outcomes statistically anyway. But these lockdown measures, they produced almost a double effect, a double detriment, in that the lockdown measures actually affected disproportionately the most vulnerable people in society. But there doesn't seem to have been any consideration of that by the people who were forming these policies. And I can tell you, I cross-examined for 4 days the chief medical officer of health for the province of Alberta. And I put this to her, and she was stupefied. She had no answer. In fact, she admitted that she had never even received advice or sought advice from someone like you, who is a quote-unquote expert economist. So that's one point where Dr. Bhattacharya certainly agrees with you. The other thing that he said, and I want to get your take on this, when I had Dr. Bhattacharya in the program, we talked about the freedom of speech and freedom of expression in the context of science. And Dr. Bhattacharya talked about this in Newtonian terms as sort of this science being a conversation across time, and how the peer-reviewed process and how it works to sort of, the strongest or steel is forged in hottest fire. So you have this free exchange of ideas that really mine out the best ones. And that this has been part of sort of the Western canon in science, and that this censorship and this suppression of information, the Dr. Fauci's of the world telling labeling renowned scientists from places like Oxford and Harvard and Stanford, quote unquote fringe epidemiologists. Would you agree that there's been this chill in academia around this important conversation that has to occur, not only in public discourse, because of course we can't defend anyone these days, but also that's filtered also into the scientific world. Is that something that you have experienced?
Totally. So yes, once again, Jay is totally correct. There are two things to add to that. One is that within quite a few governments, there were actually very early cost-benefit analysis done. So the Dutch Ministry of Economics had a cost-benefit analysis done already in April 2020. With the British actuaries connected to the government, we did a cost-benefit analysis. And there were some others, like Sanjeev Sablock in Victoria in Australia, who sort of used classic cost-benefit analyses. And also sort of health economists sort of rose to the top with some of them very early on. And of course, they found that, one should never do something like lockdowns, because they were basically regurgitating what was well known up until February 2020. But they were suppressed. That only came out after freedom of information requests by journalists who undoubtedly were sort of fed the information. Look, that was done, but government suppressed it because it didn't fit the narrative at the time. It already tells you about internal government censorship in those countries. And definitely there was the case that scientists were shouted down. This was true in April and May. I was involved in all kinds, petitions and counter petitions, and this is where the outpouring of lots of people with an opinion about costs and benefits who'd never done one in their life, and who had no idea of sort of the wider context and the well-being losses was amazing, right? There was just hordes of people who were falling over themselves to prove how much they agreed with the government and with lockdowns, and that was really necessary. But they had no idea what they were talking about. They were just showing their reasons. And so, in a science where you can say that when politics and science collided, politics won. That just has to be said hands down. Politics won, and science became its slave, and hence stopped being science. So what we previously thought of as scientists basically turned into mental slaves. They turned into a ministry of propaganda. Not every scientist. I mean, you have honest ones within every organization, but by and large, politics proved to be too powerful for truth and science. And of course, we've seen that before in history. We saw that in the Soviet system, where scientists were totally subservient. We've seen it within the Chinese system. We saw it, of course, in the fascist era. When politics really goes after truth, science just becomes subservient and loses that indeed that sort of conversation between different people with different ideas, with different perspectives, and you always have to defend yourself in a certain sense, and through that defense you are sharpened. You get an augmentation of good ideas after each other. It doesn't always work out well, but it's worked out well in the long run.
So to follow that up, you would probably agree that there's something useful to be learned from the application of these lockdown measures. And in that vein, what I'm interested to know is, what are the short and long-term consequences of lockdowns? For example, I read today a news report that 129 billion masks that are non-biodegradable were used and thrown away every month. And over 3 billion masks now pollute the oceans. That's an example of a short and a long-term impact. I've heard you say in response to the question, why were these measures imposed, that's the wrong question, that the proper question is, do they make sense? So what is your answer? What is your answer to that question, Professor? Do these measures make sense?
No, none make sense from, as it were, the perspective of either public health or the well-being of population or the general interest, which is what both politics and economics was roughly speaking about till 2020, and certainly should be about right now. Right? That is still part of public health laws to care about public health as a whole. And with masks, we know that at best they might help a tiny little. Probably in terms of how people wear them, they don't help one iota. They've been aptly described as garden gates trying to stop mosquitoes. But they have all kinds of negative consequences, including for health. They trap bacteria, you get mouth sores, you breathe worse. It's bad for cognitive development because you don't recognize people's faces. It's particularly bad for kids, right? They're then less stimulated, less social. They are, as you say, often not biodegradable, so they end up being bad for the environment. They're clogged up, they're used inappropriately. They're a sign of submission. They can make people anxious, particularly if they've had bad sexual experiences with people sort of pinning them down and raping them and taking their voice and faith away. And so in a way, they're just dehumanizing. If we want to dehumanize a group, we sort of force them to cover up. That's how we do it, right? We sort of belittle them. So no, they don't make any sense. Yeah, and particularly not, and that was clear from the start, that this thing was going to infect everybody in the end anyway. Any sort of, small gain you might claim on transmissions in the short run is really just going to move the dial to a week later, or something like that, right? It sort of doesn't buy you anything in the longer run at all. So it was basically nonsense from start to finish, just a symbolic measure of subservience to our new masters. And that goes for many of these measures. They were not well thought through. They were not advised by any of the previous plans. You should see them far more as sort of, religious measures and sort of sacrificial measures, which would have sounded equally plausible to people 3,000 years ago, and hence jettisoning everything we've learned in between.
Professor, just to follow up on that, we're experiencing in North America, and I believe in Europe as well, what appear to be some of the downstream impacts of these very, very bad economic decisions that were made via lockdown measures. Things like increased energy prices, high inflation. We're seeing increased grocery prices, all of which have the most severe impacts on the most vulnerable people in society. Do you see a connection economically between some of these bad decisions that have been made over the past 2.5 years and some of these economic impacts that we're seeing both in North America and in Europe and globally right now?
Totally. And this was predicted in 2020. So I already wrote in 2020, look, all this money printing without production is going to mean inflation. And also it's going to mean impoverishment, because we now see that who are the tech companies, the pharma companies, and quite a few billionaires have made a mint out of all this. But of course, a lot of us were small shops, small businesses have lost because they couldn't sort of cope with all the internet stuff, or they were just forced to close, like pretty much the entirety of the international tourism industry. And so, yes, this was entirely predicted. It came true, but what is, of course, the case is that if you print money as a government, you hand out lots and lots of free money, then initially people feel financially secure because they see more money arriving in the bank account and they think, well, I'm okay. You know, what are you complaining about, economic effects of lockdown? But in a way, you're just postponing the economic shock that is already there, because you basically stopped production. So you've had a huge kick on production, but it's not quite yet visible because, you know, you have lots of expenditure on nonsense stuff like masks and vaccines and all the other stuff, which cost a huge amount and delivers very little. And so this is only now becoming visible. This was an enormous economic own goal our societies have made. And how do these things have effect? Yes, all the supply disruptions mean that everything becomes more expensive, but also means people become less productive. So you just have less stuff with more money chasing it. Then, of course, you have the food, which is partly because of all the disruptions in the agricultural sector, in the trade. That feeds into much higher food prices, which leads into famines, civil wars, and we're seeing quite a few of those around the world. So, you know, the great dying in that sense, it started. We have and are losing millions of people now. And it's a direct causal effect of the stupidity of 2020 and 2021, and it's ongoing. I mean, you know, the madness is continuing. We're like in an orgy of self-destruction here. So, you know, we're immensely rich. There's a lot to destroy, so we've got a way to go yet. But it is amazing what is still happening.
Professor, I read a book some years ago, and I wrote a comment on it recently. It's probably a book you're familiar with. It's by an American economist, 20th century economist named Albert Nock. It's called Our Enemy, the State. Mm-hmm. And in the book, the thesis of the book, as I understand it, is that economic crises, to some degree, are manufactured by elites who align themselves with the state for their own advantage, and that economic crises are often exploited in order to expand the power of the state, which destroys the sovereignty of the individual, to some degree enslaves them, and consolidates power in the people who are quote unquote rulers. That certainly is, in my view, and I'm interested to get your take on this, that certainly is one description, one way of describing what appears to have been happened through the operation of these lockdowns and through these policies that were enacted through COVID-19. Would you agree with that?
It is certainly the case that this time around, the recession and the disruption has been used for empowerment. I see that as opportunistic businessmen and politicians taking advantage of the opportunity. I don't think it was planned in 2019. It was more like, oh, it's going to work out well for us. Let's push this a lot harder. And so it's almost by accident that they discovered this gig. In terms of whether or not I believe that this is true in the past, that as it were, all shocks have been used for empowerment of a small elite, not really. There have been some shocks which effectively led to reverse, right? The Second and the First World War was like that because they needed the population to fight in the trenches and to fight these wars. And that empowered those populations. Suddenly everybody knew how to use guns, but also knew how society functioned and how valuable their production was. And so you saw huge emancipation after those wars. Then you got universal suffrage, you got the welfare state. And so it's not true that all crises lead to dictatorship. And it's also not true that all economic downturns, as it were, lead to an empowerment of the elites. What you get more is this kind of longer waves, so more in several decades, whereby more and more elites become parasitical. There's a co-growth of companies and the state, and that gets to be more and more inefficient. Wealth starts to be concentrated more and more amongst a small group. But that drags the society down. A society then becomes stupid, becomes unproductive, it becomes, it's this watermelon head, if you like, right? It's going to drag all this excess nonsense around at the top. And then they go through a reform cycle, usually because they're jealous of some other country, or because somebody invades them, or effectively their own inefficiency takes them down. And that's international competition basically says that in the long run. Sometimes even just their population runs away and there's nothing left. So as it were, we do have forces in the long run which take care of this. They can take an awful long time, I'm afraid.
Professor, I don't want to lead you by the hand and guide you down the rabbit hole, but there are some conspiracy theories out there about the possible connection between lockdown measures and the expansion of government control and things like, for example, the World Economic Forum agenda, or the 2030 agenda. You will own nothing and you'll be happy. This is very much anathema to Western society, Western culture as we've understood it, at least in my lifetime. Is there a realistic connection between these COVID lockdowns, these lockdown measures, and what we're seeing now, for example, in North America, where just in 2022, over 90 food processing plants have been destroyed. And in Ontario, the largest province in Canada, it was just celebrated by our government that the first factory to develop cricket meat, if you can call it that, for pet and human consumption has just been completed. So there are people, certainly in this part of the world, who are very alarmed by this. And it looks like a connected process. From your point of view, do you see that, or do you subscribe to that, or would you put the label of conspiracy theory on ideas of that nature?
I did a lot of work on corruption in Australia, and also in Europe. So I certainly agree that there's a huge amount of corruption and opportunism out there. And some of the big beasts in corruption land are not, again, sabotaging the plants of competitors. That increases the prices that they can have. So there's also just a lot of jealousy and nastiness going on between the elites, jockeying for position, if you like. These things are really subtle, right? And they're subtle in the sense that you cannot get a coalition of tens of thousands of people by getting them in a room and saying, right, in 2 years' time, we're going to do the following in order to have lockdowns and we'll enrich ourselves. We'd never get that off the ground. Can't be done. It'd be way too conspicuous. And also there's no evidence or indication of any kind of coordination like that. What you do have is that there are lots of people waiting for opportunities. And so when this panic came out of the East and was sort of amplified a little bit by Chinese propaganda and by the WHO, politicians and populations panicked, and that very quickly brought in the opportunists. They then started to run the government with their models and their masks and their vaccine plans and everything else they thought they could sell to the politicians. And the politicians went, ooh, yeah, this sounds good. Of course, we should buy lots and lots of masks in the company of my brother or associated with my wife or husband. And in that sense, the corrupt opportunities were taken because that's the kind of time we live in. And has that led to increased coordination over time? I think yes, as well. But we don't have a full picture of how that coordination has gone. And I doubt it has much to do with the World Economic Forum, but there's definitely some coordination, and it can be picked apart. So let us, as an example, take this recent plan in the World Health Organization in order to give the World Health Organization all these powers over national health policy, allowing to interfere with basically everything that happens in the country on the supposed excuse of an additional pandemic. Now, there are valid questions to be put to that, because that's a bit like a coup. Who planned that? Who wrote up the text? Who paid for, as it were, the writing up all those plans and for the coordination between governments? And so there's something really there to pick apart, right? And if we're hence going to find, as it were, evidence of groups of scheming people, well, they've revealed their hands with that WHO plan, which was thankfully voted down by the African countries. But they might try again, as Ramesh Thakur warned us about. So there's a real, as it were, event there that we can go and trace back. How did that come about? How did that coordination go? Who has paid for all of that? There's something truly there to pick apart.
Speaking of the World Health Organization, Professor, I'm interested to know your thoughts on this. I read that back in 2019, pre-COVID, the World Health Organization came out and were pretty clear in their denunciation of lockdown measures. Of course, that changed. And now, just recently, in the last couple of days, they've announced again, they've gone back to the 2019 position. One of the things that Dr. Bhattacharya mentioned that is maybe one of the worst long-term impacts of lockdown measures in the COVID-19 pandemic is the loss of confidence in the public health system, and that this could really be disastrous. So, for example, his example was, what if we got something that was as contagious as COVID, but as deadly, as a bubonic plague, for example? What would that look like when we have at least half the population now that does not trust what the World Health Organization and what public health authorities are saying to them? So what's going on with the World Health Organization? Have they become totally politicized? They don't seem to have any degree of credibility or reliability or consistency in the things that they're telling us.
It's a good question. I've wondered that many times myself, and my reading may not be the same as those of other scholars who've looked at it. It is certainly the case that it is heavily influenced by who pays them. So they get quite a lot of money from the constituent countries, but they also get quite a bit of money from the Gates Foundation. And Gates, likes a good pandemic, as we know. And the Chinese wanted to make their own policies look good. So they put huge pressure on the WHO at the start of all this thing to not say that you shouldn't have lockdowns and what the Chinese did was stupid, because the Chinese really don't like that. And so the WHO, when this started out at sort of beginning of 2020, was reluctant to put its own 2019 plans in the limelight, and basically said, no, don't do lockdowns. That's, totally stupid. But they really left it to individual countries to implement it, and then sort of started to say, well, yes, we support this now. But the WHO in that sense has been playing a double game. So exactly at the time when they were sort of helping governments with their lockdown policies, they're also bringing out all kinds of advice to the contrary. Masks makes no sense. You had WHO scientists giving very low numbers on the IFR, such as Ioannidis. You could also hear videos of people saying, well, we shouldn't be doing this. So they seem to have a two-prong attack. Basically, they were saying anything that everybody might want to hear. And it was almost as if they had a two-track approach, a political approach and a science approach, and they let their own scientists sort of, bubble on, not give them much credence or airspace in the media, but they were still out there. So, still a few WHO reports, which is sort of quite reasonable, whilst at the same time saying all kinds of nutty things to please their donors and political friends. And so those two sides still seem to be there, and how that internally is organized, I don't know. Maybe it's conscious. Maybe they're hedging their bets, You never know who wins. They want to come out, be on the side of the winner, whoever it is. Or maybe it's just that they can't get rid of sort of the honest scientists among them. I don't really know how that internal conversation goes, but the WHO has been playing a double game almost throughout.
Professor, I'd like to turn and talk a little bit about the book that you co-authored. It's called The Great COVID Panic. I believe it was just published last September. Um, in the book, one of the things that you and the other authors state is that Sweden, to a large degree, got the COVID pandemic right in terms of their approach was, let's say, the least worst of all. What did Sweden get right, and what can other jurisdictions, countries learn from that in terms of dealing with future situations like the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, we definitely hold up Sweden as the best of the bunch. Quickly followed by all the other Scandinavian countries, by the way, which followed Sweden after a couple of months. So it's not true that you should compare Norway to Sweden, for instance, and say, now look, the Norwegians did, lockdowns in the same way that America did, and that proves Sweden was wrong. No, Norway very quickly started to follow the Swedish plans and even apologized, some of its modelers, for the mistakes they made in the first 2 months. And since then, their average restrictions have even been below Sweden much of the time. So Sweden got it right. The main thing they got right is no school closures, no forced anything, basically. So they didn't force people to be apart, but they did advise them to be apart. They didn't really force people to be 1.5 meters, masks, vaccinations. They just gave out advice. So they didn't push vaccines on anybody who was young, but they did advise it strongly for people who were very old, which was, as it were, the sensible advice at the time. So in a way, Sweden just followed the pre-pandemic plans of what to do in case of a pandemic. And in that sense, they have been the most scientific in many ways, right? I still think they were too restrictive. They should have been like Tanzania and had the president declare that, if memory serves, a goat and a papaya could also test positive, and hence we should really not take this all too seriously. But Sweden did well. And it's had better outcomes. That whole region has had better outcomes than anybody else. Government debt is much lower. The kids haven't been adversely affected. There's been no mental health crisis. There's been negative excess deaths. They actually left with a higher life expectancy than they started, and all that's the exact opposite in most of the rest of Europe.
And that approach ties into part of your approach, this Wellbeing approach. As I understand it, part of what you advocate in your writing is that, we should not live our lives in fear. We should not look at our lives as we should not live our lives in a way so that we're simply avoiding all forms of risk, because that in a way is a life, nasty, brutish, and short. It's not a life worth living. Is that a fair assessment of at least part of this concept of well-being that you advocate?
Totally. Life is there to be lived, right? Life is to be viewed as a number of years you hopefully have, and you want them to spend them as well as possible. And we humans are social animals. What we enjoy most is being around loved ones and friends, and truly being around them, not just on Zoom, but hugging them, having sex with them, dancing, make joy and be merry. And of course, a lot of that was outlawed during the pandemic, and that had hugely detrimental impacts on people's mental health, because we're not meant to be solitary animals for any length of time. And so it was particularly bad for people who were single, for the elderly, worse still for people in retirement homes and nursing homes who were left to die on their own. Their family couldn't visit them. They quickly went dement for lack of stimulation. And of course, that was horrible, right? In terms of protecting Granny, well, it's made her demented and die much quicker without her family there. In what way is that helping anybody? It's just a cruel perversion of the notion of help. And yes, what is the notion of well-being about? It is about measuring how well people are doing in their life. So we ask people themselves, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? On a scale of 0 to 10. And then we say, well, 10 is better than a 0. And a well-being is just one unit in that 0 to 10 for one person for 1 year. And that gives us a metric. That's now used by some governments, and it's used very much so by lots of bureaucracies and scientists around the world to add up effects in various spheres into well-being years lived.
The view that you espouse, you explain there, it seems like the day before yesterday was the dominant view in Western culture about how to live a meaningful life. But it seems that COVID-19 has been something of a seismic shift in this. Recently I was listening to some of Sir Winston Churchill's famous speeches. Everyone knows the one he gave out, the Battle of Britain, we shall never surrender, and so on. And I often wonder today, under those circumstances, the island of the British Isles basically surrounded with the Nazis having all of Europe, no guarantee of support from North America. What would a British Prime Minister today say? How would one deal with a crisis like that, using this sort of philosophy of let's try to prevent the worst case scenario? It doesn't sound like that's what Sir Winston was talking about. He was talking about victory, right? A victory against all odds, against all costs. That there was no other option. So what has happened in our culture? It seems like for generations, certainly a generation of people that I grew up with, were imbued with that same sense. But now today, people are, they're knocking over statues of Sir Winston. We can't talk about, Thomas Jefferson, and his famous Declaration of Independence because he's a racist. What's going on in our culture in your view? I realize your specialty is in economics, but it's obvious from listening to you that you've cast your mind to some of these broader topics. So I'm very interested to know what you think is going on in our culture, and how COVID-19 and the pandemic is really connected to it.
Yes, Leighton. Me and my co-authors have spent a lot of time on that, and also way before COVID, we spent a lot of time on thinking about groups, nation states, bureaucracies, and that's of course exactly where I worked in. My well-being methodology was indeed meant for governments, for bureaucracies. I tried to help them, to help the population. I was not against government. I tried to optimize it, and still do in many ways. A lot of this wokeism and political correctness that you refer to, of course, has a long ancestry. It goes back decades. But it's come up tremendously in the last 10, 20 years, and particularly, of course, the last 2 to 3 years. And in a way, you might say, well, we're somewhat back in the Middle Ages. I hope you'll see the connection why that's important. What we had in the Middle Ages was a very tiny elite who owned most of the land, which was the key resource then. And the vast majority of the population were peasants, and then you had this middle layer of priests. And the role of the priests was manifold, but one of the things the priests did was make sure that the population felt bad about itself, that everybody felt everybody else was an enemy. So the story of the Middle Ages of the priest was, well, fear the devil, he's in everybody else, and so don't trust anybody else, only trust us, trust authority, trust the church. And you can see who likes that kind of ideology. The top likes that kind of ideology because it's divide and rule. And it's also a form of self-loathing that you then bring into the culture. And in many ways, we're back into that same kind of economic pattern, if you like. There's been a tremendous increase in inequality. It's been a great time for the top billionaires. Really now own large parts of the world, including lands and buildings, and certainly the factories and much of the capital. And there's kind of like a new slavery gone on. And lo and behold, we're stuck with a very similar ideology again, with divide and rule. Everybody is your potential enemy because they're the wrong race, they're the wrong skin color, they've got the wrong history, they've got the wrong gender, they've got the wrong sex, whatever it is. And so we're being pitted against each other. Now, again, I don't think that was kind of set up. I don't think that was, as it were, planned 20 years ago. But it's rather convenient now, isn't it? And so it's pushed. It's pushed by groups for whom this is a rather convenient story. And for whom is this a convenient story? For the very rich, and particularly for a globalist rich elite. Because this is, of course, belittling people's sense of patriotism, pride in their country. So it is also very much taking on the story that we are patriots, that we are countrymen and countrywomen. And so it's trying to take out the direct competition. And the main competition that the rich still have to fear, or at least the rich who've gone down this path, is patriotism. that's also where I think the main hope lies in the opposition. They must be patriots. They must take up the story of Canadian well-being, American well-being, Dutch well-being, British well-being, because that has proven to be a tremendously powerful force in the last couple of 100 years. And I don't actually think that even the rich elites can stand against that if that kind of patriotism reemerges. So that's where I think it'll go. That's where the battle, I think, will be fought. It'll be patriotism versus globalism in the coming years.
So these priests in the Middle Ages, their modern equivalents are, let's say, the fall of the science experts, right? But in your book, you sort of hinted at this during your last answer. There is a positive outlook. There is a way forward, right? You talk about this getting back to a sense of patriotism and nationalism, movement away from globalism. Can you describe how, for the people consuming this podcast, how that might look like for them in terms of boots on the ground? Because I know you have a sense of this, from your book and listening to you, the sense of disempowerment that people feel. They feel like they're puppets. They're, dancing on somebody else's strings. So I know in the book, it talks about this possibility of a better way forward. But what would that look like in terms of people? What can they do in their everyday lives to maybe make a difference, not only in their lives, but by extension in the lives of their neighbors and their countrymen?
The main thing they can do is cooperate and be a community with people closely around them, and set up the structures to, as it were, pick up the slacks from where government have let it fall. So I know that in America, people have set up sort of learning pods with other parents. They're basically forming their own schools. I know from examples in Australia, Europe, and America that people are setting up their own local health systems because, of course, the hospitals and the official health system is totally failing them, far too expensive, giving them shit all the time, and really not helping at all. But also communities can organize in terms of starting to read books, starting to educate themselves, starting to become aware of how the world works, and starting to experiment locally. There's a lot of hope in local politics. Right? We've seen in places like the Netherlands, Britain as well, a renewal of local politics so that the council becomes more sensible. National politics is harder, but it can eventually also be changed. But local pockets of resistance can make an awful lot of difference because people can then move to those areas within that country. You can just, as it were, start to go over the border of the next county or the next state, and hence, as it were, lend your weight to the group within your country as a whole that are starting to make a positive difference. And we see this in the US. People are moving to Florida, they're moving to Texas, they're moving to sensible part of the countries and leaving the miserable north, which is self-destructing, behind. Now, on this wider level, on this patriotism level, this is about rediscovering and coming up with a story of what it means to be Canadian, what it means to be American, what it means to be British, what it means to be Dutch, German, French, and all that, and connect that to a positive story of who they are, who their history is, where their future might be, and to experiment in that story with, well, how are we going to set up things once we are politically victorious so that we don't get into this shit again? Right? How are we going to break up these large companies? How are we going to flush out the nonsense and all the bullshit that has flooded our institutions and also our companies? What are we actually going to do? What would a good system look like? And of course, that also gives a role for countries who haven't been sucked into this madness, like Scandinavia, like Florida, like Texas within the US, like Switzerland, like parts of Eastern Europe. Well, they now have to be the shining example. They should now show the rest what it means to be successful and to be proud of their own history and to take no nonsense. And so there is, as it were, lots of good things to be done at various levels.
So part of the message of the book, as I understand it, is that there's much to be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of why it happened. It revealed some of these issues, some of the things that you're talking about, maybe some, let's call them the weaknesses or frailties or fissures in our culture. And I'm talking about Western culture, Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, what we used to consider the Western world. But your book also poses some a positive outlook, and it suggests some solutions too, doesn't it?
Yes, we're very much, as it were, go forward thinking people. We don't just like to complain and say, oh, look, let's all be miserable about everything we've lost and all the freedoms and science. Also see it as a potential period for renewal, for re-enlightenment. And we have lots of ideas. So part of that was, as it were, organizing locally in communities and regaining a sense of what national pride we can and should have. And of course, the call for justice is always useful. Punish the wrongdoers, effectively just following the law. What should politicians have done? What should those in power have done? And what did they do? And hold them to account for that. But we all have lots of reform ideas. And one of the reform ideas we have is that we should get the top of the bureaucracy and the media to work for the population again. And the simplest way to do that is to take the power away from companies and politicians to appoint the top of that entire layer of managers and put that power with the population. And the way you do that is to say, well, you're going to appoint 5 citizen juries. So it would be a citizen jury of, let's say, 12 to 20 Canadians who would appoint a local judge. And another jury would appoint the head of the local public media. And another citizen jury would appoint the head of the local hospital. And another citizen jury would appoint the head of the educational institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So that group of sort of high-level managers, which are now firmly politicized, which are basically working against us, and which you should see as the enemy of their populations, their appointment system should come in the hand of the citizenry. It gives the citizenry something to do, but it also should give us a huge layer of managers who are on our side, who are not beholden to the politicians who appointed them or the special interests that lobbied for them, because that's not how they got appointed. And we expect a lot of good things from that. And similarly, we can involve the citizenry in allocating grants in science so that we flush out a lot of the bad stuff in science. We can use the citizenry in order to flush out bad news by being much more involved in the production of news, but also in the vetting of news. So we see sort of a rediscovery of citizenship as one of the real way forward. And of course, we can learn from successful experiments that there have been already. There have been all kinds of interesting developments with citizen assemblies, citizen juries, the Swiss system of referenda and of sort of advice-giving institutions around that. There's a whole plethora of things that have been tried that we now know could work in different circumstances that we could use to our advantage. So we should have a whole package ready to be, as it were, up and running if the political momentum shifts.
Professor, you've been very generous with your time, and I'm grateful for it. I want to ask you a question for your take on something, and feel free to decline if you don't feel comfortable doing it. You're probably aware that those of us in Canada are experiencing really an unprecedented period in our history in terms of living through a period of very oppressive government, where our government, frankly, especially our federal government and our prime minister, has really abandoned the rule of law and had little regard for constitutionally protected freedoms that we've enjoyed historically, as part of the British common law tradition. What is your perception from where you are about what's going on in Canada with our prime minister and our government?
I had the pleasure to visit Montreal not more than a month ago for a week, and Montreal was lovely then. People were free that week. It was just after lots of mandates were gone, so there was still some pleasure in Canadian society. I was happy to see. But I have followed the Canadian developments. I have friends in Canada like yourself who sort of have complained bitterly about the dictatorial nature of the regime that has now arisen. And it is, of course, hard for me to know exactly what has happened in Canadian government circles, but my take on it is that the Trudeau government has formed an alliance with the French, the Germans, the Dutch, some of the other central EU countries, because they use a very similar language. So I think that they talk to each other on the phone or whatever it is, and they certainly put in joint things in WHO and that kind of forum. But also that there's a kind of a bunker mentality in those governments. They they tell themselves that they're sort of defenders of their country and that they're doing the right thing, as mad as that may sound, as obviously as they are destroying their own productive base and the health and well-being of their population. I do sort of sense that part of the madness is that they think they're actually the good guys, and that they're sort of really bunkering down, and in that bunkering down, they're getting madder and madder. They're preparing in Europe to take down a lot of the farmers, supposedly for climate change reasons or environmental reasons, right in the year that there's this huge global famine. Really, you want to go after the farmers in a year of a famine? I mean, how crazy can you get? And it doesn't make productive sense either what they're doing. They're shooting their own economy and their productive base in the foot as well. So I really think there's a kind of a bunker mentality in those governments who are drunk on their own power, don't want to hear any advice that's not according to the narrative they have, think they're super smart and that, with their technological tools, they'll fix everything. And lots of problems come as a surprise to them because they haven't wanted to hear it. Their top civil servants probably by now are not telling them about it for fear of repercussions. And so you get this kind of Nixon Vietnam War type bunker mentality of sort of, paranoia and stupidity at the top, which then lashes out into censorship, trying to imprison some of the opponents. I mean, I don't know how much problems you've experienced, but they might come knocking on the door. It feels like that. The indications are that is the nature now of some of those governments. They've really lost touch with reality, and certainly with what is actually in the best interest of their population, and what are the limits to their understanding, and even the degree to which they're scientific at all. Right? They seem to become unmoored from realism.
The opinion you've given is quite consistent with another British commentator. I just read his book recently, Douglas Murray, The War on the West, and he shares your view of the matter that really, but he also sees that the hopeful side of it is that really is unsustainable. Would you agree with that? And and I hear what you're saying about this call to positive nationalism and patriotism in terms of being proud of your culture, that may be the way forward. That's the way out of this madness. Would you agree with that?
I certainly think that patriotism has to be in the mix, because there has to be a community formation and a reaching out with like-minded people on a positive story as to who one can be. And it's simply the case that it's at the country level where in principle the power is, where one can undo this madness, and one can, via peaceful and democratic means, hopefully, to sort of push out these dark forces which have now taken over. So I definitely think that it is unsustainable what is happening now, right? I mean, it's not just the madness, but it's also incredibly inefficient. I mean, in the case of Australia and Canada, similarly, it's meant that the whole immigration has dried up. It also means that the kids have been thrown under the bus with sort of very lengthy school closures. So the whole productivity of the next generation and even their mental health has been severely negatively affected. Food prices are going up, fuel prices, the organization of the economy is starting to unravel, the social connections are starting to unravel. It is basically an unsustainable stampede of madness. But then the question is, well, how does that kind of stampede come to an end? And that's not so easy, right? History has provided us with examples whereby that kind of stampede can go on for quite a long time and can be extremely violent, can be extremely unpleasant. In that sense, we haven't in our country seen anything yet. We've not yet seen millions of people sent to gas chambers, but it's not a total impossibility anymore. I would have said it was impossible 2 years ago, but there is now, a mad fanaticism operating in some of those government corridors. But there are still safety valves. And the safety valves that people basically still move. They can move to another country if they feel physically threatened. There's still competition between countries. So that means that it is visible that other countries have done much better. People don't like to admit it on the other side, but they do see that Scandinavian Sweden actually did get it right and is doing much better, which is partially why they don't want to know about it. They do see now grudgingly the damage that's been done to their own children, that's been done to the economy via the hyperinflation that is now upon us, and the sort of tremendous impoverishment. So it's become harder and harder and harder to keep up these rose-tinted glasses that the government has done smart things and all will be right soon. And no, there's been no abuse of power or concentration of power. So I do see hope, but I'm afraid it can still get a lot worse before it gets better. And particularly Canada, which has surprised me at the start. I thought it was a freedom-loving place, which was quite happy, and I was sort of astonished at how mad it's become. Particularly Canada, I think, might still have some dark days ahead, because I don't see the Trudeau government giving up its power, and it'll be studying all kinds of methods to sort of try and grab more of it, I would guess. And I don't really know what you can do about it, because he's just been re-elected.
Well, I think, unfortunately, that's an accurate assessment. Professor, I want to thank you for your honesty, which is quite refreshing. I think we've learned a lot today from listening to you and talking with you. If people want to find out more about you and access your writings and that sort of thing, where would they find you? What's the best? Where are the best sources of information where they can go to do that?
Just Google my name; you'll find my stuff.
I'm glad I did too. This is a part of the program, Professor, where I call it the reading list. We try to leave people. You mentioned the importance of reading. I share that view, and so this is a part of the program where we try to point people in a direction where if they're interested by what they heard today and they want to further their understanding of these topics, they can go and read something useful. And of course, it won't surprise you to know that today's selection is your book, the book that you co-wrote, called The Great COVID Pandemic: What Happened, Why, and What to Do Next. And the description here, I'll just read from it if you don't mind, is how to make sense of the astonishing upheaval of spring 2020 and following. Normal life, in which expected rights and freedoms were taken for granted, came to be replaced by a new society as managed by a medical ruling elite that promised but failed to deliver virus mitigation, all in the name of public health. Meanwhile, we've lost so much of what we once had: travel freedoms, privacy, democratic presumption of equality, commercial freedoms, and even the access to information portals. Something has gone very wrong. And then the book, which is published through the Brownstone Institute, tries to provide some answers to these questions. And of course, we've had a bit of a preview of that today, and we're very grateful for that. I've only read the first couple of chapters of the book. I'm working my way through it. I can tell you it's a very well written book, and I would say very readable. It's not. Would you agree with me, Professor? It was by design to be a very readable book. It doesn't read like an academic text, right? It doesn't sound like it was written in the Lancet or something like that. So it's a very readable book. I don't want to give the impression that it's dumbed down, but it is fascinating. It's very well written, and it's designed to be readable for, let's say, the general public and not for somebody who has a PhD. Would you agree with that, Professor? Was that by design?
Definitely by design, and that's definitely also why our third co-author is there. So the first two are eggheads, that's me and my co-author Gigi Foster. We also included the journalist Michael Baker exactly for that purpose, because the books that Gigi and I used to write were not read by many people. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, high level stuff. Yeah.
And with this sort of thing, it's too important to just only talk to 10 eggheads around the world who will all agree with you. But at the end of the day, that's like pissing in a wetsuit. Nobody notices. So we definitely, we also felt it was our duty to try and reach out to as many people as we could with what is still a quite cerebral, a quite dense story. There's still a lot of information on that book, a lot of ideas. So we were trying to put a lot of ideas in as readable as possible. If you've managed to wade through the first few chapters and haven't been put off yet, wait till you get to chapter 9 and see if you make it through that. But yeah.
The one thing I've noticed already that's very impressive is everything is very, very copiously backed up by data. There's a real attention to that. which I really appreciate, because not everything that's written about COVID certainly is like that. Some of these books that are out there read like like rants. To me, that's not very persuasive. So over to you. You're the professor. Can you provide folks with a suggestion about something they could go and read, whether it's a website or a book that you would recommend to them to further their understanding of some of these topics that you've written about?
Yes, I personally advocate people to read far and wide. Right? If one just obsesses about this period, you miss the understanding of world history and previous events. So read something about, for instance, the Soviet economy and why that failed. Or read something about how the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart because of the enormous bureaucracy. Read Kafka, right? Because the Times now, with its bureaucratic madness, well, that's exactly what Kafka described as well. And so you'll feel a sense of recognition, but also a sense of history in that, right? As to why it is like that. And also that was overcome, a sense of hope, right? By seeing the mistakes of the past that were overcome, at least at some time. There's also a hope there. There's also something else that very few people read about, which is about crowds. So there have been famous books written on crowds. Norbert Elias wrote on that. Elias Canetti wrote on that. He wrote a fascinating book called Crowds and Power, and half of it reads a little bit as if he was stoned out of his mind. But he still makes some very deep observations about how just whole groups of people can go totally nuts. And I have found it impossible to understand this time only via the traditional lenses of, corruption, people are trying to do bad to us, or some notion of rationality, which is, this is in somebody's interest and they were just mistaken. No, there's real group madness there. There is just herd behavior, and herd behavior is the deepest, the most difficult sociological element to understand. We know it from the 1930s, we know it from previous parts of history, but we've forgotten. And so if people want to be truly intellectual, go and read about crowds. And I would say Elias Canetti is, as it were, the most murky, but also the most interesting. Or you could just go to famous crowd writers like Gustave Le Bon. There's the poet Mackay wrote something 2 centuries ago, which was very apt. He sort of looked at various crowd behavior. So, yeah, read about crowd.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. We're so grateful for your time and for your knowledge. Thank you for being part of Grey Matter. We wish you all the best. And we hope to have you back sometime, perhaps after you write your next book.
I would love to be back in free Canada. And the very best of luck. I mean, you guys are doing an amazing job. And so keep it up. Keep it up. It's a long slog.
Thank you, Professor.